Hi, George Durkee, Geography 66 at Columbia College, and back again with the continuation of creating web maps using ArcGIS Online. And this is lesson 3, where we will start visualizing and planning our map. That is, what do we want to do? Why are we doing it? And how do we go about it? And part of that process, obviously, is then finding and adding data. So go ahead and, if you haven't already, open up a blank map, uh, as I showed you how to do in the last intro video. And as you may remember, we left it centered on Sonora, and I had used the search function here in the lower right to zoom into Sonora. And so far we haven't titled it. And one more thing I want to point out here. When I talked about the new viewer, which is what this is, you can recognize that by all the tools here on the right. But then you also have so-called classic. The default now should be to open in the new viewer, and you shouldn't have to worry at all about classic. But if you run across one of my earlier videos from last year, instructional videos, which you shouldn't, because I will zap them all. They're done in Classic, and so on the off chance I miss something or you're watching somebody else's video, make sure they're in the new viewer. Now, as you start a map, there are a bunch of considerations you should keep in mind. The first, obviously, is why you're making the map. And you want to begin to visualize what you want to say and how that can be presented using data on a map. Also, of course, who your audience is. That'll affect how complicated the data is. And to a certain extent, you start with your data. You start getting an idea of what's out there, and that may involve just throwing stuff in there and seeing what works and what doesn't work, because you want to see it, you want to visualize it on a map as you go, and with luck you'll edit and get rid of a bunch of stuff, because the next point is everything you put on the map should have a reason. You don't want to clutter things up, but on the other hand, you want to show what needs to be shown to tell your story or make your point. And art is definitely a part of it. The aesthetics of a map is probably the difficult part, and I constantly have trouble with that. So, once again, it's a balancing act of using your data and then adding symbology that stands out to emphasize your data, labeling your points so they're identifiable, and the trick, again, not cluttering things up so it's overwhelming, so that you can just look at the map and you get an instant idea of what's going on. And you also have to remember that everything about a map is a compromise. You can't put everything you want in there, and you are representing a usually a 3D, in-depth scene onto a 2D, or even if you use a 3D map, it's still only a representation of the terrain. There's an old phrase, the map is not the territory, but the idea is to get the map as close to the territory as you can, so that people can imagine what the territory is as you represent it on a map. Now, of course, for some types of maps, and especially if you're working for a company or something like that, your map is going to be constrained either by existing standards. So both fire and search and rescue have standards. They have standardized symbology and standardized ways of showing how a fire or a search should be represented. So that's one constraint. And of course, another one is, if you're working for a company, and they tell you how it should be done, well, there you are. They usually have templates on how things should be done. And then finally, pretty obvious, a map is the evidence of spatial thinking. And Esri used to have a phrase they used a lot, thinking spatially, and that's obviously what a map is and how you want to start thinking about how you present all this stuff. So, there's a lot of little points there. Eventually, this kind of becomes second nature, or maybe third nature. But in any event, it's stuff you ought to keep in mind. But I don't want to overwhelm you, because your first maps, and even throughout this course, I'm just expecting the basics. If you can get some of the basics down, you're fine. Because I want you to learn the workflow and some of the basics about where to find data and how to edit. And then we're good. And the rest you can pick up with more experience. And as an example, because I can't help myself showing examples of more web maps, this is one I'm currently working on or tinkering with, might be more accurate. I've used LiDAR, a LiDAR profile of vegetation on the Columbia campus. A number of you know, or maybe you're involved with it, where there's a lot of thinning of vegetation and prescribed burns going on the Columbia campus to thin out the vegetation. And one of the benefits, of course, and the main reason for it, is to reduce fire danger around the campus. And so I used 2021 LiDAR set of the entire county to do a profile of the vegetation in the 1 to 4 meter range that's considered the ladder fuels. The ladder fuels are obviously what get lit during a fire at the bottom and burn up into the canopy. I'm not, well, too much information as always with me, but I'm not sure that way of looking at it works for live oak, which is mostly what the campus is. It's low brush, some grasses, and then live oak, and so 1 to 4 meters may be too high. But in any event, you can see what I've got here. I've got the boundary of the campus in purple, and roads and all the buildings. And I've used a color balance for the roads and so on, which aren't common, but I think it shows up. And here are also the structures outside the campus, houses and so on. And then finally, I'm representing the vegetation using what's called a color ramp. And we'll go over here to the legend. So I represent the vegetation in the 1 to 4 meter zone as a percent density of vegetation. And so, the green is the lowest percent density, and then the red is the highest. So you can see on campus here, they've been doing a pretty good job of clearing out vegetation in the center of the campus, and then just northwest a little bit here, you can see it's pretty dense, and as well as south. So were a fire to come through, and I don't know a whole lot about fire behavior in live oak, but those of you who are around for the Washington fire down by between Jamestown and Sonora know that they burn pretty hot and pretty fast. So it's a really good thing that the campus forestry and others are starting to clear this out. They've got a little work to do here in the north and just on the east part of the campus. And then I also threw in photographs. I took photo points along the road, and so you can click on one and you get a photo point. And so you can see a representation of, so you're looking north here, so you can see what that green uh, vegetation looks like. It's pretty clear underbrush here. You know, in fact, there's almost none. So that seems pretty accurate. But anyway, this is just a rough sketch of what I'm looking at. But the workflow was as I've described it. You know, I had an idea, and I thought that a map would best show what's going on. And I'm still tinkering with it, but you can see the balance of colors, trying to keep the data as minimal as possible so as not to confuse things. Okay, so finally we're back at our map here. And notice it's untitled, so I would recommend the first thing we do is to save it. And here we'll call it Geography 66 Fire Info Map. And then I'd like you to put your name and initial. And then the folder you're going to save it to is, if we can find it here, A, B, C, D, E, F, Geography 66. So this will go under Geography 66 Fall 23 Web Maps in my case, and with luck you made a similar name for it. And tags, well, we'll just leave that blank for the moment, and you'd want to leave a summary, public information, public info map, fire public info map. And you'd want to add to that later, especially if you release it to the public. But that's your metadata, so that tells not only you, but other people what's. So to answer the question of why we're making this map, it's to better inform the public in a graphical way that they can easily see where evacuation zones are, where road closures are, and where roads are to get them out of an area, and to have that map updated in a timely way so that information is as near real time as possible. And I mentioned in the previous video that the problem was that evacuation orders and evacuation warnings were done by text from the sheriff and or a Nixle alert, or probably both. So you can see here a list of areas that should be evacuated, road closures, and so on and so forth. And that's great if you really know the area and can orient yourself within those zones. But as I'd mentioned earlier, visitors to an area, especially an area like ours, which has a lot of recreational users who don't know the area, staying at hotels and so on, and even locals, you may not know exactly where you are in a given area, especially, you know, when there's a lot of smoke around and a feeling of danger, or if not actual panic. And of course, the other way is when a phone alert is given, and you get the same thing.
Sheriff's Office, there is a mandatory evacuation order for Alley Drive, Golden Dove Lane, Circle Drive, McKibben Drive, Golf Links Drive, North Drive, Crooked Lane, Millville Estate.
And you get the idea there. Again, listing off a bunch of streets, and you know, you get it repeated, but then they end the recording. So, you know, if you didn't catch everything and or go to the sheriff's site, which with luck has all the streets listed to look it up, then you know, that's a problem. So anyway, that's the problem we're trying to solve with this map. And now let's start adding some data. I've made a little more than a cheat sheet. This is actual current data that you can consider to put into a fire map. And I'll have the link both in the Canvas assignment and in the text below the video itself. It'll be a link to my Google account, and you can download it there. So, it'll have things like satellite thermal hotspots. There are a couple of different types. There's VERS and there's MODIS. Active wildfires with current perimeters in the west, and it'll also have California fire perimeters. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of different stuff you can put in there. Structures are important because then you can get an idea of how close a fire is to existing structures, and so on and so forth. But obviously we're not going to put all of this in there. I just want us to put in maybe 4 or 5 different feature classes, these are called, and all server-based. And then we'll also, a little later, we'll create one of our own data feature classes, and we'll create that within ArcOnline. So finally, let's actually add some data here. Let's go to Add and Browse Layers, and here are the same other choices that I showed you in the intro video. And everything's taking a while here. So these are the data sources I have in my content, and probably in your content you won't have anything, or if you're taking another class you'll have some if you've been using ArcGIS. But we're going to go down to, for the first one, we're going to go to Living Atlas. And so for a search, let's try, because you may not know the actual vocabulary of search, so let's try fire hotspots and see what we end up with. And look at that, coming right at the top here is satellite, thermal hotspots, and fire activity. And that little green check shows that it's authoritative, that is, it's being maintained and served out by a trusted source. But it's always a good idea just to go and click on the feature class itself and see what it is to get the metadata. And so where this comes from is satellites operated by NOAA and NASA, and it looks for thermal imagery within a certain heat range. And this is your description down here, best practices and so on how to use it, and what you can do with the layer, so on and so forth, and where it is. So good enough. Let's add that to the map. Get rid of that. Now MODIS is a different type of thermal imaging, and it's kind of been improved on by the VERS thermal hotspots. Sometimes it's useful because they're taken at different times of the day. VERS is usually, it used to be twice a day. They might have increased that by now, but you only get 2 passes by the satellite per day. And so if MODIS is kind of out of phase with that, you can often end up with 4 images per day that kind of tell you what's happening with the fire. Now, something to keep in mind, because when we publish this, we want people to understand what the limits of the technology are of what we're putting on there. So they might think, for instance, that the VERS hotspot is where the fire is, but of course it could be 6 hours old or even 12 hours old. So anyway, that's just another consideration as you add data. And as a side note, most fire folks think that adding the thermal hotspot imagery is a little too much information, especially given the limitations. So it'll show the fire as it was as long ago as 12 hours. But anyway, it's an interesting way to show fire, so we're going to use it here as a database. So we've added it, and let's go back and actually see what we have. That's our one layer there. And the good news is for Central Sierra and much of California, we haven't had many fires this year. Usually when I give this course, and especially in the fall, we get a lot of catastrophic fires, or at least large ones. But this year, the holdover fuel moisture from last winter, the record winter 2023, has been really high and has kept most fires in the central and southern California at a low level of activity. But not so for north of us, Northern California and Oregon. So let's take a look there where there's some active fires going. And we'll just use the search function to get us up there. And you can see some hotspots up here, a couple of large fires still burning. And so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and create a rectangle, and that'll zoom us in. I'll do it one more time over this fire. And we'll click on an individual point here, and that'll show you the information from that. So that particular one is 78 hours old. There's a way of symbolizing the colors by age, or even eliminating anything older than, say, 12 or 24 hours. And actually there's some databases that have that already pre-done for you. But the point there is that's what can be confusing about using the VERS hotspot imagery. And now let's keep adding data here. I think what we'll do in this video, I'll add 2 more feature classes. And then I want you guys to look over the list of links that I provide and add, say, 3 more. And in the next video, we'll get into editing, where we'll change the symbology and add labels to better understand what it is we're seeing. Now, just to show you, things do not always run smoothly in the Esri and Arc universe. One way to add a feature class to your map is if you know the URL of where the service is. So for instance, I checked this out 2 weeks ago and it worked. So it's a direct link rather than having to look it up. So I'm going to copy, and we go then to add, and we add this directly from a URL and paste it in. And I get an error message here. And I'll be blindingly honest, I don't know what's going on. I've tried it with 2 different servers. When you look it up online, and this is how you troubleshoot, and I always write a long note, usually in announcements or something like that, on what to do when things glitch. And this is pretty important, well, in any discipline, but it's especially true with computers and with GIS, because you watch the usual video, instruction video, and everything works perfectly. The bad news is that's not the case. And so what do you do if it doesn't work? So I entered in service does not exist or is inaccessible under ArcGIS Online. And other people have that problem. Now I didn't go into the endless rabbit hole of troubleshooting this particular one. And I will later, but I don't know what's going on is the short answer. So we're going to go back to the old-fashioned way of looking up by a word search, looking up the feature class. So once again, let's go to Add and Browse Layers. And incidentally, I can't remember if I mentioned this, but the default comes up as my content. And more than occasionally, you'll probably make the mistake of starting to enter in a search term, but it'll only search my content. So you have to make sure you get the drop down if you want to go to Arc Online or Living Atlas. Now let's go to ArcGIS Online and let's search for current wildfire perimeters. See what we end up with. And USA current wildfires. Let's try that. Again, it's authoritative, and I'm just going to add it in and see what we end up with. And we got exactly what we're looking for. We get both a polygon layer showing the perimeters of the fire and a point layer showing the location of the fire, and that'll have information about when it started, acreage, and so on. And we'll get into that in the next video because we'll use that information to create labels. And let's add one more here. So we've done active wildfires, current perimeters. How about let's do current weather and wind data. That's important for a fire. Although you'll notice I'm tending more towards the type of information that would be useful within a command structure rather than a public information map. But we'll fix that later. So let's X out our current search and let's search for current weather and wind data. Now in this case, I took it entirely from my previous search. And if I had just put in current weather, I got a whole bunch of stuff of weather warnings and so on, but I didn't get much on actual weather reports from weather stations. So this will give it. Now note the graphic here shows Florida, so this is where you especially want to check the metadata, again clicking on current weather and wind data to make sure that it's the entire US and not just Florida. And as a side note, if you do the week 3 exercise of the Esri lesson, online lesson, you'll be using this data set here, current weather and wind station data, which is kind of neat. Anyway, let's add that one. And notice over here on the right, we've got the, let's get rid of that and go back to layers. And so that's highlighted. And so when you highlight it, over on the right here, you get the symbology as well as activate a bunch of other tools here. So the properties give you, again, the symbology, as I said here, and the arrows are relative to the wind speed. So there's no weather stations within our current view here, but let's go out a little bit here. And there's some up here. You see these little arrows here are wind direction. And you click on one, and you get air temperature, water temperature, and wave height. So that's a buoy out in the ocean. Okay, I think we'll wrap it up here. As I say, I've added 3 here. Oh, and save. Always save. So I've added 3 here, and if you guys would add 2 or 3 more and look over that list, come up with 2 or 3 more that you're interested in and that you think the public would be interested in as far as keeping an idea of where a fire is. So one of the feature classes in there. For instance, this Caltrans road closures, and I'll add it in the next video, but see if you guys can do that by yourself. Okay, thanks a lot. In the next video, as I said, we will do some editing work, working on the symbology and the labels. So see you then. Thanks.